Welcome to the Megillah Project.
One story, many angles.
Come learn with us.
If someone were to say to you, hey, remember that part of the book of Esther where Mordecai has a dream about two dragons fighting each other, you would probably look at that person like they were crazy. But the fact of the matter is that actually there is a version of the book of Esther where that actually happens, believe it or not. It's of course not the version that we know from Rabbinic Judaism, the version that we read in the synagogue on Purim, but in fact, the ancient translation of the Bible into Greek by Jews in the Hellenistic period, the Septuagint, includes in the book of Esther some remarkable and quite extensive additions to the story that are completely absent from the Hebrew version. These are embellishments that reframe things or clarify gaps in the narrative. And they are basically an early form, a pre-rabbinic form of biblical interpretation by Jews. And even though these additions in the Septuagint are, of course, not religiously normative for contemporary rabbinic Jews, there is still value, I think, in reading them because they offer insight into the way that ancient Jews were thinking about this remarkable text. And so what we're going to do in this presentation is we are going to look at 3 examples of additions to the story in the Greek version of the book of Esther. These are not the only additions in the story. There's certainly more than 3. But these, I think, provide a good overview of the variety of issues and strategies that are at play in these editions in the Greek text. And I'm gonna put these up on the screen, and basically each of these we're gonna go through them in a similar format. I'm going to put up first the version that is familiar to most Jews from the Hebrew version, so we will start with that. Then I will switch to the Greek version and we'll compare those two. And then finally, I will offer some reflections of my own on basically what is gained and what is lost. So what do these narrative additions add to the text in terms of substance? Like, how do they transform the story? How do they create nuances that are not present in the Hebrew version? But then also what is lost in the process? What aspects of the Hebrew version do they suppress or erase? And we're going to see that both of these dynamics are actually present here. For time's sake, I'm not going to read directly through all of these. So I invite you, when they are up on the screen, to just pause the video if you'd like and read them quickly. The Hebrew versions, of course, if you have your own edition of the Hebrew Bible at home, you will have access to those. And the Greek editions to Esther can be easily found on the internet. And of course, all of these will be presented here in English translation. All right, so we are going to dive in here with our first example, which is how the story starts. And the opening act of the book of Esther in the Hebrew tradition is one of the most iconic scenes in the whole story. It is this lavish banquet that Ahasuerus, the Persian emperor, holds, and there's this famous incident in which he demands that his wife Vashti parade herself in a rather undignified manner in front of all of these drunk men, and she defiantly refuses, and she is dismissed as a result of this, probably executed. But she is celebrated in the modern contemporary Jewish imagination as sort of an early prototype of a feminist hero for this act of resistance. So that's the basic arc of the opening act of the book of Esther in the Hebrew tradition. And what's really striking about this from a narrative perspective is that the Jewish protagonists, Esther and Mordecai, are actually absent from this whole thing, right? We have to wait until all of this transpires before they are introduced. So there's this kind of delay of the actual central characters. With the Greek version, things are about as different as on every front as you could conceivably imagine. And this is the sort of crazy episode that I was alluding to at the beginning of this session. Mordecai is introduced straight away. Notably, Esther is actually not part of this. We were just introduced to the male protagonists here, which perhaps says something about the way that these Hellenistic Jews understood, the relative importance of the male versus the female heroes in this story. Esther is just totally absent. We're introduced to Mordecai. Mordecai has this totally crazy dream in which two dragons are fighting, and there's, rivers are exploding, and the nations of the earth are trembling in horror before this, and it's this total chaos. And Mordecai wakes up and is like, what the heck was that about? And of course, you reading this, if you're not familiar with this part of the Greek tradition, are probably wondering that same thing. So the interesting thing actually is that it turns out way less random than it might seem at first, because while dragons fighting and all of this might seem like something more out of Tolkien than out of the Bible, the truth is that there's actually a long and vibrant tradition, mythological tradition, stretching all the way back to the pre-biblical ancient Near East, of a battle between the forces of order and chaos, or good and evil, where basically on the side of chaos and good is this royal deity, the God of Israel in the Israelite tradition, in the Jewish tradition. And then on the other side is this watery monster who represents chaos and evil, sometimes literally manifest as a sea monster or a dragon, right? The biblical manifestation of this, the most famous one is the Leviathan, who shows up in certain Psalms and in the book of Job. But also there's a more subtle manifestation of this actually in the mysterious deep, from the beginning of Genesis, in Genesis 1. And so there's this mythological tradition of a battle between a deity and a dragon that has to do with the battle between order and chaos that the biblical writers actually inherited. And what we're seeing here is the Jewish translators of the Bible into Greek are actually drawing on this mythological tradition, which was very active in the Second Temple period. They're drawing on this mythological tradition in order to reframe the story of the Jewish conflict with Haman in Persia as actually a manifestation of this larger cosmic battle, right? The opposition of the Jews and Haman becomes an instantiation of this larger cosmic drama, right? With of course the Jews lining up on the side of good and order, and Haman becoming basically the human representation of the dragon, right? The human representation of chaos and evil. And there's actually also a long tradition of mapping that chaos monster onto various human villains in Israelite and Jewish history as well. So this is also drawing on that application. So what's gained from this is precisely what I just said. It takes this story about the Jewish community in Persia, which might seem to be kind of, rather remote. It's not something that has to do with the entire people like we're used to thinking about biblical narratives. And it sets it within a larger cosmic frame so that the reader is cued in to why this story of this one community matters for the whole people of Israel. What's lost, I would say, is the dramatic impact of delaying the introduction of Esther and Mordecai. There's something that's very kind of literarily satisfying about the introduction of the Persian context and then zooming in on Esther and Mordecai, right? There's a lot of literary artistry there that and that subtlety is sort of taken away when we just start immediately, not just with introducing Mordecai and Esther, but then also explaining exactly what this story means, right? Exactly the significance of the story, right? You lose a little bit of the mystery and the literary fun of letting this unfold and kind of figuring it out as it goes along. That loss of literary subtlety, by the way, you're going to notice is going to be a theme as we look at these different examples. The next example I want to look at is Esther's preparation for going before her husband, the emperor, after she and Mordecai learn about this plot by Haman to kill all of the Jews. So the issue here is that they know that their only hope is to cue the king into this plot, but you can't just go before the king. That's not how royal protocol works, and it's potentially deadly to show up uninvited before the king. But there's no other option here. Esther is going to have to risk it because she needs to inform the king of what's going on. So in the Hebrew tradition, right, Esther basically accepts that this is going to be potentially a deadly mission. She asks Mordecai, she says that she and her maidservants are going to fast in preparation for this. And then she asks Mordecai and all of the Jews of Shushan to fast basically in solidarity with her, right? And then doing this in preparation, she is going to go in before the king. So we see that narrative here. What's interesting is that in the Greek version is that it doesn't sort of change outright what's going on in the way that the first example we looked at did, right? The first edition was just straight up putting in something that was not there at all, right? This dream and these dragons. Here what we have is more like embellishment, right? We have this amazing, long, elaborate prayer. And this is actually only an excerpt of it. It's actually much longer, but Esther prays to God in addition to the fasting, right? She actually explicitly prays and speaks to God before she goes in to see the king, right? And this is really remarkable because it shows her engaging in religious action, and it calls attention actually to her religious practice, right? You see here that she actually clarifies that basically she's kept kosher, right, while she's been living in the palace, right? She says basically the ancient equivalent of, I've only eaten cold dairy, right? I've done whatever I can to not eat treif while I've been living here in the imperial palace. We get some insight into her mental state, right, and her emotional state. She talks about how much she hates being in this position, right, and being remote from her people and from Jewish religious practice. So what we gain here is some insight into Esther's experience specifically around religiosity. And this is actually a major gap in the story that exercised a lot of later Jewish interpreters, including the rabbis who dealt with this through midrashic exegesis, right? So here we see a kind of an earlier example of Jews being troubled by this. Like, why don't we hear anything about Esther being Jewish religiously? So this prayer provides that answer for Jews who are wondering this. What's lost, though, is, again, something of the narrative subtlety, because even though stylistically, as like a work of literary artistry, this poem, this prayer is quite beautiful, it is a little bit overdetermined. It's not subtle in any way, right? And it takes away a little bit of the elegance of the concision of the Hebrew version, right? One of the things that makes the Hebrew version so compelling is that there's a lot of depth precisely in what is not explicitly said. And you do sort of lose that in the Greek version because it goes into so much detail here. We're going to move now to our final example, which is the very next scene, the emperor's reaction to this kind of scandalous appearance that, without being summoned, that Esther makes. So in the Hebrew version, it's so quick that if you blink, you'll almost miss it. Basically, she walks in, and Achashverosh looks upon, his radiant wife, and immediately says, why are you here? But in a welcoming way, like, what can I do for you, right? I'm so happy to see you, Esther. Like, how can I help you, right? So the tension of this buildup, right, in terms of, is Esther going to survive this encounter? It's immediately dispelled because the king, it says here, she won his favor immediately, right? And it's okay, so she's safe. Really interesting adjustment here in the Greek tradition. Ahasuerus reacts with fury, right? Exactly as Esther was worried about, right? Ahasuerus says in his head, right? He's thinking, are you kidding me? Like, you're gonna, I don't care if you're my wife, you're gonna come into, the royal chambers without a formal invitation, right? And he's ostensibly about to kill her, right? Lifting his face, flushed with splendor, he looked at her in fierce anger, right? It's very, very vivid, right? And then what happens? God directly intervenes. Then God changed the spirit of the king to gentleness. It's almost like this inverse Pharaoh, where instead of hardening the king's heart, God softens the heart. So God swoops in, and directly intervenes, and then we get this adjustment of what's in the Hebrew version in terms of what he says, right? Making the point totally explicit. What is it, Esther? I'm your husband. Take courage. You shall not die, right? So God intervenes, changes this anger to favor, and then explicitly calls attention to that with what Ahasuerus says. So what is gained here is God's direct involvement in the story. Again, this is a classic question that Jewish interpreters have long asked. Like, God is not explicitly present in the story of Esther. This is a famous theological issue in the book, and so this puts God directly in the story by saying that this thing that happened, where Esther came before the king and survived, that he didn't kill her, this was actually God's direct intervention, and we're going to show that for you explicitly instead of letting it kind of sit between the lines. So what we gain is an understanding of how the God of Israel was actually directly intervening to shape this narrative toward the salvation of the Jews. But of course, that thing that's gained, I would say in this case, is also exactly what we lose, right? We lose the theological subtlety and mystery of God's indirect involvement, right? One of the things that so many people have found meaningful and enduringly significant about the story of Esther is that it offers a vision of Jewish life in which God can be seen as acting from behind the scenes and not directly intervening like in the stories in the Torah, right? And this precise feature of the book of Esther has actually been something that has made it a resource, a theological resource for diasporic Jewish communities for a very long time, struggling under imperial domination, just like the Jews of Persia. So we gain some insight through this Greek edition into how God is active in the story, but we also lose the theological value of God's very absence. So we've seen here that we have these three additions to the story in the Greek version of Esther, all representing different kinds of exegetical strategies, reframing, embellishment, transformation, subtle but significant transformations. And you can see these sorts of things borne out in the other substantial additions to the story that we didn't get a chance to look at in this session. What I would say about this by way of conclusion is that I am not suggesting that Jews should start reading the Septuagint version of Esther on Purim, right? We have liturgical commitments to the Hebrew version of the text, and I think that it is possible to maintain those religious liturgical commitments while also appreciating these variations from antiquity, right? It should not be problematic or threatening to normative Jewish religious life to explore alternative versions of this story that Jews in antiquity were working with, right? We do this all the time with rabbinic midrash, and just because the Septuagint is pre-rabbinic and therefore not really incorporated into the normative rabbinic tradition, it is still part of a broader Jewish tradition. And I think that contemporary Jewish communities have a lot to learn from not just what we see here in the additions to the Book of Esther, although those are certainly very interesting. But I hope that also more broadly, if you found these additions interesting and theologically and literarily compelling, this is the kind of thing that we see all over non-canonical Second Temple Jewish literature. Books like those that are preserved in the Christian Apocrypha and non-biblical texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is meaningful ancient Jewish literature that we as contemporary Jews can learn a lot about and can incorporate into our study of the Jewish textual tradition in rewarding and valuable ways.